Set for tomorrow, House Speaker Mike Johnson works to keep his fractious majority intact. And an Arizona lawmaker talks about why she publicly announced her decision to terminate a non-viable pregnancy.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
Actually, you don't need vision to do most things in life.
It's exciting to be part of a team driving the technology forward. I think that's the most rewarding thing.
People who know BDO.
A law partner rediscovers her grandmother's artistry and creates a trust to keep the craft alive. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your passions, and the way you enrich your community. Life well planned.
The Candida Fund, committed to advancing restorative justice and meaningful work through investments in transformative leaders and ideas. More at candidafund.org. Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and the advancement of international peace and security at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The Department of Justice and more than a dozen states sued Apple today in a landmark antitrust case. They argue that the tech giant has created an illegal monopoly in the smartphone market by using excessively restrictive hardware and apps that keep customers locked into Apple's ecosystem and that puts a, quote, chokehold on competition. That includes its payment and messaging systems and basic connections with other apps. Doha Mekki is the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the department, and she joins me now. Welcome to the NewsHour.
Hi, Amna. It's nice to be with you.
So the Department of Justice is arguing here that Apple's monopoly comes at the expense of developers, of rival phone makers, and also consumers. Tell us more about that. How specifically are consumers being harmed?
Sure. So today's lawsuit was filed about alleged monopolization, monopoly maintenance to be specific, by Apple that we allege has artificially thwarted competition in the smartphone market. And specifically, we allege that Apple imposed restrictions on apps, products, and services that threaten to disrupt Apple's smartphone monopoly. And so consumers really suffer the consequences of that. Sometimes that looks like higher prices for smartphones, including the iPhone. It looks like disrupted innovation by potential developers that harms the entire ecosystem for smartphones. And it also means that Apple is thwarting technologies and emerging paradigms that may make consumers device agnostic altogether.
So part of Apple's response, as I'm sure you've seen, says the lawsuit threatens what they call the principles that set them apart in the market. Here is part of their response now. They say, if successful, this lawsuit would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. Doha, as you know, part of the Apple appeal, what makes them so popular is that they have this integration across this suite of systems and apps. Everything just kind of works together. Is there a sense here that DOJ is punishing them for what customers like them best for?
Absolutely not. The United States is in favor of consumer electronics and products and services that work for consumers. And competition is the best way to make sure that there is ample opportunity in the market for different kinds of providers to offer more of what consumers want. The United States government in its lawsuit is also very in favor of privacy and security, and specifically, none of the conduct that we challenge in our lawsuit is necessary to ensure privacy and security.
So part of the DOJ's challenge here is to prove that the benefits Apple delivers to consumers don't outweigh its alleged antitrust practices, right? How do you do that?
So, there will be many months of discovery and a long road to trial in this case, which we very much look forward to. And one of the things that we will focus on is really developing a full record ahead of trial about all of the ways that Apple undertakes anti-competitive and exclusionary conduct. And obviously, Apple will have an opportunity to put forward any alleged justifications for its conduct. And it's our burden to show that the exclusions and restrictions that they deployed in their app store, through developer guidelines, et cetera, outweigh what's required to deliver their products and services.
So if the lawsuit's successful, what kind of changes could DOJ be looking Apple to make? Could you be looking at structural changes, for example, breaking the company up?
So that's really a legal question. Our burden right now is to demonstrate an antitrust violation. And it is black letter law in the United States that a remedy really has to be tailored to redress the violation and prevent its recurrence. And so it's too early right now to say what the precise contours of a remedy are, but it is the role, the tradition and longstanding goal of the Justice Department to take on monopolies and pry open markets that have been encumbered by abuse of monopoly power and make sure that the forces of competition can take hold so that we are protecting the opportunity for next generation technologies and disruptive services and products that Americans have always looked forward to. It's about making sure that the next generation of Apples are allowed to take hold.
This lawsuit does follow years of regulatory scrutiny of Apple. We know they've already fought off a number of other antitrust challenges. What prevented the DOJ from taking action sooner? Action that might have saved some of the consumers it says were now harmed.
This lawsuit was actually filed after a methodical, careful, and very deliberate investigation. As you know, we take our cases and our facts as we find them, and we only file lawsuits when we are confident that we have real competition concerns that can't be addressed short of going to court. And so that's what happened here. And so there's no doubt justice delayed is justice denied, and we'll be excited to try our case just as soon as it's ready.
That is Doha Mekki, Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
In the day's other headlines, the quest to end the grinding war in Gaza took Secretary of State Antony Blinken to Egypt on his latest Middle East mission. Blinken met in Cairo with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and later with his Arab counterparts. And he voiced hope about mediated talks in Qatar between Israel and Hamas.
Negotiators continue to work. The gaps are narrowing, and we're continuing to push for an agreement in Doha. There's still difficult work to get there, but I continue to believe it's possible.
Meanwhile, in Gaza City, smoke billowed from a fourth day of fighting around the Al-Shifa hospital complex. The Israeli military said it's killed more than 140 Palestinian gunmen there. Ukraine's capital city has suffered its heaviest barrage of Russian missiles in weeks. Military officials say all 31 of the missiles were shot down. Still, falling debris caused extensive damage to residential buildings. In all, 13 people were injured in the attacks, including a child. The European Union today formally took up the question of using frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine's military. The interest on those assets could provide more than $3 billion a year. EU leaders met in Brussels, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was among those endorsing the plan, despite Russian warnings that it amounts to theft.
I am quite sure that we are sending a very clear signal to Putin here. He has made a miscalculation if he believes that we are not able to support Ukraine for as long as it is necessary. And the use of windfall profits is a small but important component.
The European move came as $60 billion in American aid for Ukraine is still tied up in Congress. Back in this country, sentencing concluded today for 6 white former law enforcement officers who tortured 2 black men in Mississippi. The final pair received federal prison terms of 27 years and 10 years. The 6 defendants admitted to torturing Michael Jenkins and Eddie Parker after breaking into a home without a warrant in 2023. The Biden administration has announced it's forgiving a new round of federal student loan debt. The announcement affects 78,000 teachers, nurses, firefighters, and other workers in public service jobs. It cancels nearly $5.8 billion in student loans that they still owed. That makes nearly $144 billion in federal student debt forgiven so far by the administration. And on Wall Street, computer chip makers led the way, and major indices finished at record highs again. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 269 points to close at 39,781. The Nasdaq rose 32 points. The S&P 500 added 17. And a passing of note. Richard Higgins, one of the last survivors of the Pearl Harbor attack, has died in Bend, Oregon. He was a U.S. Navy radio man when Japanese planes attacked on December 7th of 1941. In later life, he became an engineer. Richard Higgins was 102 years old. It's believed that about 24 other Pearl Harbor survivors are still living. Still to come on the NewsHour, why suicide rates are higher among tank units than the rest of the Army. Californians approve a plan to address homelessness and mental health. The life-threatening risks associated with eviction. And Dartmouth basketball players push the boundaries on unionizing college athletes.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Congress is on the verge of passing a large spending deal 6 months into its fiscal year and with less than 48 hours left before a partial government shutdown. Lisa Desjardins has more on what has made this Congress one of history's most dysfunctional. Lisa?
Right, that dysfunction is one of the defining characteristics of this House of Representatives. We have a narrow Republican majority that has made governing unpredictable and at times impossible. The basement of the U.S. Capitol is a messy place of power, of lawmakers in a thin majority and dim light. For the past 15 months, House Republicans' regular meetings here have showcased the most chaotic majority in modern American history.
A speaker has not been elected.
Not just the 15 votes it took to find a first speaker, nor the unprecedented ouster of that speaker in just 10 months.
The office of Speaker of the House is hereby declared vacant.
This is a whole new concept of individuals that just want to burn the whole place down. That doesn't work.
But other failed votes that should be easy.
The nays are 216. The resolution is not adopted.
To keep government going, Speaker Mike Johnson has repeatedly suspended the rules to pass key legislation like spending bills.
This will be a 5-minute vote.
Common internal divide has taken an uncommon form.
We need to be instilling trust. We need to be instilling confidence, not showing dysfunction. However, I know they don't mind the debate either, and they don't mind it being public as well.
And that is the point to some.
Like we all said, the border is the number one issue. What are we going to do about the border? Nothing, right?
If you recognize that face of House Freedom Caucus member Chip Roy, it may be for his repeated public criticism of Republican decisions. He's one of 19 or so GOP rebels who say the party compromises too much. They have power in part because of the slim 3-vote margin in the House. And starting next week, disorder will make that even tighter.
Too many Republican leaders are lying to America.
With the departure of Colorado Congressman Ken Buck, who has blasted Republicans as pushing lies for former President Donald Trump. Now, leaving months before his term is up, he's blunt.
It is the worst year of the 9 years and 3 months that I've been in Congress. And having talked to former members, it's the worst year in 40, 50 years to be in Congress.
I think that this is a tough moment that can really define the conference overall.
Erin Perini is a Republican strategist who worked for Kevin McCarthy in-house leadership. She sees bright spots, including wide agreement last week on the bill to limit TikTok. But the underlying tension remains.
Some people are never going to want to compromise. They want to stand where they want to stand. But to be able to get the conference to move legislation together forward, that's the big thing.
The situation's been a bit of a nightmare for Republicans like Sarah Chamberlain, who heads the Republican Main Street Partnership that includes 75 House members with a creed focused on governing. Chamberlain has watched debates turn into public disarray and knows of worse behind the scenes.
I mean, there's almost been fistfights. And it's funny, we're not the parliament in England. I mean, they truly have been very close to some real problems on the floor and certainly in conference.
Fistfights, that's like from a different era.
Right. The Democrats should be the group we're working against, not fellow Republicans.
In her alliance are members fighting for their political lives in swing districts, and she says fighting for sensible governing on the floor of the House.
Patriotic Americans.
She points to rebels like Matt Gaetz of Florida who have used social media and a small margin to derail what should have been simple votes, like on the rules for debate.
No one ever does that, but now it gets done on a pretty regular basis, which is unfortunate. They don't want to be in the team, and maybe they're okay being in the minority. At Main Street, we certainly do not want to be in the minority.
But what Republican hardliners want is to dig in. What others in their party see as a nightmare, they shrug off.
In the last 200 plus years, show me a year that isn't dysfunctional. Everybody just looks back on it through the, through the rose-colored glasses of time, but it's always dysfunctional.
Some of your mainstream guys in swing districts say they're getting hurt by it because the Republicans look like they can't
So I'm
govern.
supposed to compromise my views? No, I'm not going to compromise. The country's too important to me.
In the small Capitol basement, it's all a massive test for a new speaker, trying to govern with members who don't agree on what that means. Now, hardliners say the disorder is within GOP leadership, that they skirt rules, bend or break pledges. But the majority of Republicans I speak with say no. The issue is the hardliners, that they demand untenable positions like allowing a government shutdown. Some hardliners see shutdowns as leverage, even right at this moment, Amna, and others see them as a disaster.
Fascinating look inside the conference. But Lisa, remind us why this all matters. I mean, who's ultimately impacted by all this disarray among House Republicans?
We've been used to dysfunction before, but this is sort of a special situation this last year and a half. When you have this level of dysfunction, there is not time, there is not the room on the Hill to deal with the real problems that we have in this country. Let's take the deficit and the debt, something that I think both parties agree needs to be addressed. While these hardliners have spent a lot of capital trying to deal with it, in truth, what's happened is they've gone the other way. While they've sort of held the line on spending here, there isn't time to actually get work done. Another thing that's important here, Amna, is this is why we have continued risks of shutdown. We almost had a debt ceiling problem, and this is the rest of the world looking at America as an unstable democracy. Just this week on Monday, Vladimir Putin in Russia called American democracy a catastrophe. So our reputation in the world is at stake with how the House of Representatives is able to do or not do its job, and of course, the majority is also at stake for Republicans.
The world is watching. Lisa Desjardins, thanks as always.
You're welcome.
The patchwork landscape of abortion restrictions in a post-Roe America can be both confusing and dangerous. This is true even for some lawmakers, one of whom took to the floor of the Arizona State Senate to describe her own recent experience with a non-viable pregnancy.
After numerous ultrasounds and blood draws, we have determined that my pregnancy is once again not progressing and is not viable. And once again, I have scheduled an appointment to terminate my pregnancy. I don't think people should have to justify their abortions, but I'm choosing to talk about why I made this decision because I want us to be able to have meaningful conversations about the reality of how the work that we do in this body impacts people in the real world.
Eva Birch is the Democratic whip of the Arizona State Senate, and she joins me now. Senator Birch, thank you so much for joining us. And let me just begin by saying how very sorry we are for your loss.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate the sentiment. It's obviously an unfortunate thing to happen, but I'm so glad that I have the opportunity to turn this sad moment into something that's powerful and meaningful and has the opportunity to affect change.
Well, tell me a little bit about your decision to share that decision publicly. How easy was it to decide to speak out on this floor like that?
Well, of course, it's a complicated decision, but I don't know that it was a difficult decision. I started going through this process, and as I was having my initial consultation where you kind of have to have this counseling in Arizona, it became really clear to me that I was being told who I was in that counseling meeting and that my provider didn't want to say the things that they said. And I felt a strong sense of responsibility to take ownership of that back and to tell people who I was instead of the other way around. I knew I had an opportunity to do that. I know that there is this stigma about who the abortion patient is, and the way that I was being treated was unacceptable to me, and I had to speak out about it.
Tell me a little bit about what the reaction has been like from your fellow lawmakers, many of whom may disagree with you on this issue.
I have a lot of respect and appreciation for my fellow lawmakers. I have good relationships with many of my fellow lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, but we do have an extremist Republican leadership in the Arizona Senate. And I'm not particularly surprised that I don't think that I was heard by the leadership in the Arizona legislature. But what I do know is that I was heard by so many other people. I've had an overwhelming response of people reaching out to me, telling me their own stories, sharing their experiences. And it makes it really clear to me that we're in an environment where people are ready to be heard themselves and they're ready for change.
You did lay out in your speech the multiple steps, as you just mentioned there, that Arizona state law currently requires women to go through to legally get an abortion, including getting an invasive vaginal ultrasound that you didn't need, but you also said your medical provider was, quote, forced to tell me multiple things that don't apply to my situation and some that are just transparently, factually false. What did you mean by that?
Well, several things that were specific to me was that, for example, I was told that adoption was an option for me or that parenting was an option for me. I didn't have a viable pregnancy. It's cruel to tell someone that they can be parenting when that's not really an option for them. This was a wanted pregnancy. We would have been very happy to carry a healthy baby to term, but that wasn't in the cards for me. I was also told that if I chose to continue my pregnancy, that the father would have to support me financially, which also wouldn't apply to my situation. I have a very loving and wonderful relationship with my husband, but I certainly don't need to be financially supported in that relationship. And that wasn't a practical application to my situation as well. Providers are also forced to talk about the probable anatomical properties of the fetus at the time of the abortion. And in my case, that also didn't apply. My embryo was dying and was not subject to the probabilities of a healthy pregnancy. And again, it was just cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was clear to me that it wasn't medical providers, it wasn't experts who were putting this list of counseling together. It was people who were opposed to abortion who were trying to be coercive and convince me to make a different decision.
Senator Birch, you've made clear your views and your beliefs on this issue, but as you know, there are many people in Arizona, many people across the entire U.S. who don't share those beliefs. They don't believe that you should have a right to an abortion at all or after a certain point, and they may ask, why terminate a pregnancy at all? Why not continue to carry it even if it means miscarrying? What would you say to those people?
Well, I would say that those people should not have an abortion if they feel comfortable and if they would want to carry to term themselves. But I would say that people don't have to feel obligated to explain their stories and to explain their situations to others to gain their approval in order to have autonomy over their decision-making and over their health care. Now, are there reasons other than a medical necessity or other than a non-viable pregnancy that people get abortions that can make other people uncomfortable? Of course there are, and that would maybe have high disapproval from other individuals. Of course there are. But we also have to look at the reality of what the outcomes are for people who seek abortions and are unable to get them. And there are real serious consequences there as well that should be considered. These patients are more likely to be the victims of domestic violence. They're more likely to be evicted. They're more likely to not be able to afford basic needs for their homes. Their living children are less likely to be developing normally. They're more likely to have developmental delays. There are so many consequences that can happen when someone is unable to make a decision for themselves. And I think that we have to allow people to make those decisions because it usually is the right decision for them. The vast majority of patients feel good and confident about the decision that they made. And I think that we have to allow them to do that.
That is Democratic Arizona State Senator Eva Birch joining us tonight. Ms. Birch, thank you so much for your time. Alarming suicide rates among the military and veterans can be traced to the stress and trauma from the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But those conflicts are over, and suicides remain at what the Pentagon calls an unacceptably high level. As Nick Schifrin details, a new report reveals that within the Army, Armor Brigade combat teams, which revolve around tanks, have the highest suicide rates.
Since 9/11, more than 30,000 active duty service members or veterans of the post-9/11 wars have died by suicide. That is more than 4 times the number of those who've died in combat. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has repeatedly said that even one suicide is too many and that the department must do more to prevent suicide. A new report by the Army Times found the highest rates of suicide are among soldiers in the Army's tank community. It was written by senior reporter Davis Winke, who joins me now, and I'm also joined by Craig Bryan, a former Air Force psychologist, member of a congressionally chartered study about suicide in the military, and author of the book Rethinking Suicide: Why Prevention Fails and How We Can Do Better. Thanks very much, both of you. Welcome to the NewsHour. Davis Winke, let me start with you. In your extraordinary report, you found that between 2019 and 2021, tank brigades experienced a suicide rate twice as high as the rest of the active duty force. Why?
Nick, it's tragic, frankly. New trends in suicide prevention research are linking daily hassles and sustained stress over time with higher suicide rates. That functions by stripping away the resilience of somebody and potentially making them more vulnerable to suicidal behavior if they experience an acute stressor in their lives. A lot of people in the Army community have known for a long time that the tank brigades are not okay, that they've been run ragged over the past decade. But I didn't realize how deeply that had impacted service members down to the core of their beings. There are service members who do their 3 or 4 year contracts and never know anything but the relentless grind that these types of units have experienced.
What you're talking about is what you call operational tempo, what the military would call operational tempo. Talk about that a little bit more, and also about what you call a lack of cohesion. What did you find in these tank brigades that aren't necessarily in other brigades?
What we found for Armored Brigade combat teams is that because they've been in such high demand overseas over the past 10 years, that their op tempo, as it's shortened, got largely out of control. They would spend 9 months abroad, come home, and they would have 18 months just to prepare to do it again. And over the course of those 18 months, they would have to spend a lot of time in the field, away from their families, preparing for the next deployment, or in their motor pools, fixing their vehicles for the next training exercise. And that really compounded over time. That combined with manning requirements that essentially say, if a unit is going to deploy to Europe, it needs to have this many of its slots filled. What that meant, functionally, was that in order to have a brigade meet those requirements to go overseas, you would have to break down other armor brigades to fill in their empty slots. And when it comes to a loss of cohesion, that's referring to the fact that tank crews would be broken up in order to achieve those administrative requirements. And Nick, you can't exaggerate how tight-knit and close a tank crew is, and that loss of cohesion can't be overstated when it occurs.
Craig, Brian, let me turn to you. What's your reaction to this? What stands out most in these findings?
Yeah, I think one of the things that stood out to me as soon as I heard about the statistics was the focus on the tank community as a whole. I think when many of us think about military suicide, tankers are not necessarily what comes to the forefront of our thoughts. We have long seen and understood suicide as something that is sort of a characteristic of the person. And so we think of, in many ways, resiliency or suicide risk being something that a person has. But what we understand is that over half of those who die by suicide do not have a mental health condition. This is true within the military as well as outside the military. And we know that for those without a mental health condition who struggle with suicidal thoughts and die by suicide, oftentimes it is environmental life stressors that are much more common. The prevailing thinking right now about suicide prevention just really has not embraced that complexity.
Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, as I said, has discussed combating suicide as a priority, and the department has a campaign to reduce the number of suicides, including foster a supportive environment, improve mental health care, address stigma, revise training, and promote a safety culture. Are those working?
Well, I think it's a little bit too early to tell. Being a part of that congressionally mandated review panel last year, we offered over 100 recommendations of ways that we believe the Department of Defense could change how they approach suicide prevention, and many of those have only started to be implemented. And so I think it'll take a little bit more time for us to see what works and what doesn't work. But I think one of the key takeaways from that committee that many of us served on was that right now the DoD doesn't really seem to have a centralized strategy as it relates to suicide prevention, and that a lot of the way that it thinks and approaches this issue is very reactive in nature.
Davis Winke, is that what you've